It's my family, myself, and my 5 children.
Well, thanks for your call, Justin. I appreciate it. Let's move our eyes now to Italy. Giuliio Miaotti is the author of the book called The New Shoah. Shoah means Holocaust. He is a frequent contributor to the op-ed section of IsraelNationalNews.com. He publishes approximately once a week there. He's an Italian journalist, and we're speaking to him right now from Italy. And as the author of a book that has given you time, intimate time to spend with victims of Arab terror here in Israel, and getting into their lives, seeing their injuries, feeling their pain, hearing about the aftermath of loss of jobs, loss of marriages, divorces, loss of children, or a loss of a spouse or father, and how it's affected the Israeli people, not just the immediate families, but the families around them, the neighborhood, everyone. It's a rippling effect. Tell us, now that you see that the murderers and the people who contributed to the murders of these poor Jewish families are going to be going free now. Arabs who are laughing at what they did and said that they're going to go back to terror, that no one is going to silence them, no one is going to stop them from doing what they believe, and that is to kill Jews. How do you feel as the author of the book called The New Shoah, as someone who has seen the pain and knowing now that their perpetrators are going to be walking the earth absolutely free, as free people? What do you think about the Gilad Shalit deal that we just saw take place this morning with the freeing of all of these convicted murderers and convicted terror felons?
It's a very sad day, I think, for Israel. Each of us shares the Noam and Aviva Shalit joy with all his heart, and it's hard to imagine their horrible suffering over the past 5.5 years. But the joy, I think, it's mixed with a great sorrow. And it's the sorrow of the release of hundreds and hundreds of terrorist mass murderers, serial killers of the Jewish people, and the sorrow for the difficult feelings and suffering of thousands and thousands of Israelis whose dear ones were brutally murdered by these terrorists. So I think the field of justice has today been violated, and it's a happiness for people with a very short memory, I think. And from a political perspective, I think it's one of the Israel's worst military defeat in its modern history. And it's a defeat that is being celebrated with cheers, not just in Gaza or in Judea and Samaria and West Bank, but also in Tel Aviv. And I think the meaning of the deal is that killing Israelis, and you can stay in prison only long enough for other terrorists to kidnap another Israeli soldiers and win their release. The deal means that 55-year sentences mean nothing, or that a life sentence doesn't mean life, really life. And as over 1,000 terrorists are freed, it is meant to recognize that every Israeli institution today has failed to deal with terrorism. And it means also the Israeli war on terrorism is failing. And I think it's begun to fail when Rabin and Peres cut a deal with Yasser Arafat. And it failed when Israel adopted a defensive and a peacing strategy of retreating behind walls. And it failed when Israel traded off the worst terrorists in prisons for a brief rush of happiness and joy and relief and positive feelings, which is what the Shalit deal really comes down to. So the liberation of Gilad Shalit created waves of euphoria and relief throughout the nation, and I understand. But each of us, or including those bitterly opposed the agreement, identifies with the families. But it will be much easier from tomorrow to recruit terrorists when they are encouraged to believe that no matter how many Israelis they kill, if apprehended, there is every likelihood that they will be released. So I think that from a political perspective, a state under siege must not allow itself to be subjected to blackmail and extortion by terrorists.
All right, we're speaking with Giuliò Miaotti. He is the author of the book, The New Shoah. You can find it at Amazon.com, by the way. I wanted to ask you, do you think now that the terrorists have been emboldened, the Hamas has seen that this formula works, kidnap a soldier, get over 1,000 Hamas and Fatah prisoners freed, do you think that now that this deal has been done, that this will bring more terror?
For sure. The Almagor Victims Association a couple of years ago released statistics that about 200 Israelis were killed during the Second Intifada from terrorists who have been freed in previous deals. The same Marwan Barghouti was freed during the 70s, and then he was one of the headmaster of the Second Intifada bloodshed of the Jewish people. So only the fools can really think that this is a day of happiness. It's a very sad day, I think. And I think it's a sad day that began during the Lebanon War, the 1982 war, when the Israeli military strategy changed forever, and Israel began to withdraw to a defensive position, and all the images of soldiers killed, the appeasement was the Peace Now movement, the Four Mothers movement. It was the time of the objectors in the army. It was a strategic and cultural and moral and ideological withdrawal from what is going on really on the field. And I think it's a very sad day because most people who are now cheering the Gilad Shalit in his town don't understand the continuing devastation of grief in the people and families who survived to the attacks whose masters are going to be were freed by Israel. Fathers who died of earth attacks, mothers who get sick with cancer, children who leave school, families whose only child was murdered. So depression, suicide, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And there are trembling elderly people, totally independent. And there are people who go insane and don't want to live anymore because they are haunted by the sound and images of the suicide attacks, and they seclude themselves in their homes. And naturally, the focus in the last year have been on the people killed in the terror attacks. And we saw many protests and manifestations in the High Court yesterday from the families of the victims. But more than 8 times as many have been wounded, the Israelis. And I think the wounded people is the true face of the war against the Jewish people, which is their opinion about the Shalit deal. And Jews scattered and scared, living reminders of what I called in the book the Israeli 9/11. And they required years and years of costly and complicated physical and mental rehabilitation. About the 40% of the survivors of the attack will have permanent disabilities. And there are people who are still hospitalized with injuries sustained in suicide attacks. So this is not a political game. It's a drama. It's a drama of the Jewish people in about the last 20 years of attacks day after day in a kind of giant ground zero.
So with the release now of all of these prisoners and the fact that, again, they see that this formula works and these people are now roaming the globe, roaming either Gaza or Egypt or someplace else outside of Israel, they're among other civilian people. Do you think that not only Israel is in more danger from the release of these prisoners, but also the wider world?
Yes, I think it's a turning point in the history of the war against terror. But I think that Israel is too soft and too good in the measures taken against terrorism. If you think about how a Western country and nation will have Jew in the same position of Israel in the case of Gilad Shalit deal, I think no other countries in the world will have accepted to release 1,000 terrorists. And so I think that Israel is losing ground since the Oslo process, when it allowed the PLO and other terrorist armies to move their bases from Tunis to Judea and Samaria and Gaza in 1994. And since then, 2,000 Israeli families have paid the ultimate price for the freedom of the Jewish people and for the political deals established by the Israeli leadership. And so now we see that Israel accepted that hundreds of them, of these people, drivers, mechanics who made the bombs to use for the suicide operation, are returning to the houses in Judea and Samaria, near the houses of the Jews of the Yesha. So what is happening to them? It's a tragedy. I think it's a tragedy, yeah.
Before the interview, I asked you if you were Jewish. I'm speaking with someone in Italy. You wrote a book called The New Shoah, The New Holocaust. And you told me that you were not Jewish, and I was very surprised that someone in Europe who's a journalist would be taking the side of Israel, which we don't often see, and it's very refreshing to see that. So tell us why you wrote your book, and also, what would you do, being a Gentile? What would you do if you were the Prime Minister of Israel? How would you have handled this?
I don't know. I think it's a failure. Many other columnists in the Israeli press wrote about the failure of the military intelligence, of the Shin Bet, of the Mossad in giving to Prime Minister an alternative to this deal. About the Jewish identity, it's a false argument because most of the Israeli writers and journalists never wrote anything about the victims of terrorism. And if 9/11 is today is an emblem of evil remembered worldwide, Israeli suffering has been deliberately forgotten, especially because the Israeli mainstream journalist class decided to forget. So we have, for example, read everything about the American mothers and fathers who didn't came back home 10 years ago, but we don't know. We do know how the demonic strategy of silence worked so well in the case of Israel. So today it's as if the Israeli victims never existed at all. And the civilized world should feel ashamed, I think, for leaving the Israelis alone during the Second Intifada. And I think it's there is a lot of hypocrisy in the way today many in the West are cheering the return of Gilad Shalit. And so I think the loneliness of Israel today is you can touch by hand about looking for the desperation of the families of the victims yesterday in the High Court. Yeah.
All right, again, we're speaking with Giulio Miati. He is a journalist. We're speaking to him now while he's in Italy. That's where he's from. He's an Italian journalist. You wrote a book, again, called The New Shoah, The New Holocaust. Why do you believe that this book needed to be written? What is important about your book that the world needs to know, that you even took the time and the effort and the painful interviews that you conducted in order to write this? What do we need to know that your book discusses?
I think it's important to know that it's the first book that tells the story of the Middle Eastern conflict completely from a Jewish perspective. The state of Israel is the story of demography that it's booming, the high tech, the so-called startup nation. But from my perspective, what happened in the last 20 years was a war for survival, was a war against the civilian population. It was the worst tragedy of the Jewish people after the Holocaust. And that's why I used the controversial and very dramatic word Shoah for the title. In the book, I tried to build the story of Israel in about 50 interviews I had with families who lost relatives in attacks. And I think for the first time, even the sufferings of the people in the so-called settlements paid during the Intifada is told completely from a positive perspective. Instead, many other books completely neglected. And I think it's very important. It's a testament of the Jewish people. It's a story of hope. It's a story of faith, of love, of people who rebuilt their lives after destruction. I think it's a moral example. I think that the families of the victims of terrorism are our moral heroes, and they are really saints for me because they hold on the value of life.
Well, thank you very much for your thoughts. Again, we were speaking with Giuliò Miaotti. He is the author of the book called The New Shoah, The New Holocaust. He's an Italian journalist. We've been speaking to him from Italy, and I want to thank you again for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with us on the latest news here in Israel of the exchange for Gilad Shalit.
Thank you, Tamar. Thank you.
This was a special live break-in radio broadcast, and this was covering the return of the kidnapped soldier Gilad Shalit after 5 years being held by the Hamas terror organization. And we are all happy here in Israel. We are all so, so happy here in Israel that Gilad is finally home with us and with his parents.